our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard and Mike on the road, assisted by Albert. We're going to do something really exciting, both today and hopefully over the next month to 6 weeks. We've been talking about a couple of things at our team gatherings. One is fusion. There's something going on. It has changed, and so we have been feeling that from different ways. And so the first thing we wanted to do is sit with a fusion company and really understand it. So I'm really pleased to introduce Michl Binderbauer. He's the CEO of TAE. We are out in the Los Angeles area. We have spent the time with him and his team this morning. And so we're super excited this is our first ever fusion discussion, and we've thought it was time, and you were gracious enough to have us. So thank you, Michl.
Thank you for coming and giving us the opportunity to talk to your listeners a little bit, introduce the promise of that, which is enormous.
Well, it is very exciting. And then the only other thing we've been talking about is just California is such a unique place in so many ways. The technology, the energy, the power, the environmental thinking, the industry, the talent, the beauty. It's an amazing place. And so today is the first of what may be 10-ish. We're saying 10-ish because there's so many, we don't know where to stop. Just today we learned about a boron mine we might need to go to. But there are so many places we could go. So this is the first of what we hope will be a lot of really interesting California-based shows. Mike Bradley, you were with us remotely. Sorry you couldn't make the trip, but somebody's got to watch the screen and keep the world in order. What would you tell us about what's happening in the world today, Mike?
Yeah, Maynard, sure miss you on the West Coast, but you were holding down here Texas pretty well. So, look, it's markets are a bit erratic here. Obviously, just from a bond market standpoint today, prior to today's CPI print, the 10-year Treasury yield had spiked to like 4.65%. However, a much lower CPI print today of negative 0.4%. It pushed 10-year yields down to roughly 4.55%, and so that's rallying equity markets. Tomorrow we'll get the June PPI report. If it also prints cooler than expected, then that takes a lot of pressure off the Fed to raise rates, at least temporarily. From a broader market standpoint, the S&P is rallying roughly 0.5% today obviously on the cooler than expected CPI print and solid 2Q results from the U.S. major banks. However, the Dow's down a little bit today because IBM is down roughly 30%, which is its biggest one-day stock price decline in like 50 years. And it was due to a huge second quarter sales miss, due to IBM customers delaying mainframe and software spending in favor of chips and servers. So that seems to be a theme. And so I guess IBM surely won't be the last casualty of a temporary slowdown in software spend. As far as oil markets today, Brent and WTI are, so far this week are up about $8 per barrel. WTI is around 79 to 80. Brent's around $85 a barrel. And it's because of the Iran ceasefire is coming apart here and the effective closing of the strait. Prior to this week, oil markets had kind of factored in everything going back to normal in the strait. And what we're finding out is that we're back again to anything but normal. So, that's one thing. The other thing is we have a global refining problem, right? We don't have a global oil supply problem, in my opinion. The biggest story this week, and frankly, the last 3 or 4 weeks, has been the strength in global refining cracks. Even though global oil prices have come down from $100 per barrel, global refining cracks, for the most part, are at or above Iran war highs. A big reason for that is that global product inventories are tight. But a really big reason for that is, due to these higher cracks, is that Russian oil refinery capacity is down to roughly 1.5 million barrels from last year at this time. And that's due to Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refineries. And Russian refiners are big diesel exporters to Europe. And so that's raising the whole complex. As far as natural gas is down a little bit in the U.S., but I think the story is over in Europe again. You have gas prices in Europe have gone from essentially $16 an M to around $19 per M, and that's totally due to the Strait of Hormuz being closed. And one of the things we've talked about for the last 3, 4, 5 weeks is that European gas storage inventories are 20 to 25% below average. If you basically don't get LNG exports out of the Gulf, you're going to have Europe relying on exports or imports from Asia, and so that's going to be done at higher prices. So that's what we have. As far as the energy sector, it's up around 3% this week on higher oil prices. And bottom line, energy investors, and we talked about this last week, are gearing up for oil services second quarter earnings, which begin next week with the big three oil service companies. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. The last thing I'd say from an oil service standpoint, a really interesting story today is SLB, the old Schlumberger, and Liberty Energy are forming a strategic alliance for data center infrastructure and power. This alliance would combine modular infrastructure from SLB with Liberty's integrated power solutions to accelerate global data center deployment. We're going to expect more of this is going to be happening oil service earnings, but we're interested to see, especially with Q2 earnings coming up, if E&Ps start to enter the fray. So those are some of the bigger stories that we're covering right now. So we'll send it back to you, Maynard.
Okay, well, thanks, Mike, and we'll get you in here as you listen for a question or two. Michael, what a fun morning. I had to confess to you that I was one of those people who was like, gosh, fusion, when is that really going to happen? Do we really need to be paying attention? And it has struck us over the last year. We do need to be paying attention. Your tour and discussion illustrated, thank goodness we came to see you because there is so much going on. You are the oldest private fusion company on the planet. Like you joined this effort in 1998. That's really an incredible amount of time to be pursuing this. You've seen all the ins and outs. Let me just say thank you. And I can't wait for the audience to hear some of your history with the effort here.
Well, thank you, first of all, for that. That's very kind. Yeah, I think, we clearly started, as most people, a bit naive. I was 28 at that time, fresh out with a PhD in theoretical physics, where everything is clean on a sheet of paper, right? And with a brilliant PhD mentor who had a very novel concept for fusion in that time, which was looking at the end in mind. And we started the company actually together with the idea that we would drive a North Star, which is defined by a power plant, rather than what's next, what's the easy next step for scientists to do, right? And so we had to go plow new terrain. We're agnostic to the difficulty of the science. And I couldn't be happy with the outcome. I mean, we're obviously not there yet, but we're really close now. And I hope what we saw a little bit here and earlier when we toured, the technology is ripe now for that final summit assault to get the net energy. It's something that we think in the next 5 years we can deliver, and it just invigorates me every morning.
Well, I would say, from someone who just took the tour and has been learning about the company, $1.3 billion or more has gone into the company. I mentioned you started in '98, so you've been at it that's 28 years. So a lot of time. You have a lot of critical partners. Google and Chevron are, two names that jumped out at me, but I know you have other value-added investors. But then when you go around the complex, it's striking that, this is massive engineering. This is not, these are not just plans or blueprints. I mean, there is massive engineering going on and has gone on, and you are doing, I think your number was 50 experiments a day collecting data on how it works. But it's just incredibly impressive.
And that's, in fact, part of why it takes time, right? I mean, it built these things out methodically and with foresight, and then the mastery of each step to go from the known to the unknown. And we've done a lot to accelerate it. You mentioned some of the partners, Google, for instance, right? We've done a lot in machine learning and AI, in tools to accelerate both the path from A to B, and then also the quality of the outcome, right? Do you get the results you're looking for? Can you scale beyond what you hopefully the goals set and get behind the, further beyond that? We've done that in some of the milestones we've reached faster and with higher performance output. And all those tools, in fact, were not there when we started, and we had to create them on the journey as part of that, right? And I think when you then come back and you see that all coming together, it's very tickling and, sets you up well for the next step.
I was thinking the very first stop we made on the tour was, these are my words, not yours, but sort of the power regulation area. Because, and again, my words, not yours, but what I heard is, when you are attempting fusion, right, you need a big burst of power, like something like a gigawatt for a short instance. And you can't just go to the local power company and sign up for a gigawatt. So you had to find ways to collect power and then hit it with a burst. That's given way to a whole new power management subsidiary of the company. But let me have you explain that. But just the power management side of this is fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me see a paradigm sort of statement first, and I'll talk about power. This is basically like a moonshot. It's like NASA going and conquer the humans on the moon, right? That led to tons of technology as byproducts of that quest because that the mission requires these things. It's the same here, and power is so critical for us. And as you said, here the consumption is up to a gigawatt at peak rate, and the grid feeds us a few megawatts. So you got to figure out how to do that, right? And when we solved for that, as we were showing you earlier, the DNA of that is now transplantable into lots of areas where we have pinch points today, whether it's the distribution of power around the electrification of transportation, whether it gets into data centers and what I call stationary power consumption of large industrial consumers, the data operators, the Bitcoin miners, et cetera. And each of those brings unique challenges technically to how they interface with the grid. And it turns out that we've created the most flexible, most adaptable, and most efficient way of doing that. Again, focused on fusion to enable it, but now it's got this other secondary life.
Well, I was thinking as you were introducing us to all that, you used the data center example. And would you mind walking through that? Because I think people will then, that's a very good analog, I think, for what's happening here. And it's obviously a problem that people know we need to solve about data centers and how they throttle up and down.
Yeah, so starting with this here, right? So this is not only power hungry, but the swings are at the extreme. Sometimes we need power in a magnet, sometimes we need in a fueler, and that can swing the loads on the gigawatt level. So this system had to be able to respond on that kind of load swing, and the time scales for us are literally on the millionth of a second. And in the data center world, it turns out, particularly in AI data centers, those swings are typically on the blink of an eye, which is about 1,000th of a second. So we're about 1,000 times faster, but the technology we created can now cover the whole gamut of timescales, right? And so now you've got a DNA in a new technology piece you can deploy against load swings at the gigawatt level on a data center during its training runs for these large language models, for instance, where it can stabilize both the power that goes in, but also the grid side, right? Because there are reflections back that create echoes that can either destabilize grid equipment, or you've got an islanded situation, can blow out a turbine shaft, et cetera, right? And this is the kind of DNA and technology application now where this power supply system we developed can completely solve, and in a way it acts like a shock absorber.
I was thinking that the use of the word moonshot, this is, again, me, so you might not see it this way, but it's like when I hear that word, to me, that means a venture capital fund is doing something that's impossible. Like that's kind of what it means.
Yes.
But when we used it, moonshot, when we were talking about it on the floor, the analogy was really in the original moonshot, i.e., we're going to the moon. That effort spawned, because as each problem was subsequently solved to put a man on the moon, it spawned all kinds of new approaches, new technologies,
Absolutely.
new solutions. And that's really the context of it. And I didn't appreciate coming into TA today that you have this technology solution culture, and the company is spawning all these neat things as it cracks the code on the way to fusion. Would you mind just talking about that aspect of the company?
Yeah, I think that's super important. I mean, first of all, given that we're of an age of, say, 3 decades, you would hope that we've done a lot of innovation or it wouldn't be where we are, right? So that spawned, first of all, a ton of IP, about 2,500 applied patents. We currently hold probably about 1,600 or so. That goes up and down because we're getting rid of old stuff. It's a big portfolio, and it's about 20% of what I'd call the overall IP back. There's probably 80% in know-how. But the main point is that as you do that, you just incubate lots of opportunity, right? And while this is geared to fusion, and we're very deliberate, there's obviously the side opportunities, and sometimes they're just too good to not do something, and sometimes it's synergy. Like, for instance, the power systems. If you think of the power market, you have generation, and then you have distribution of power, right? That's the sort of the total of the power market, and they're about equally in terms of size. And with that technology on the power supply side, we're actually impacting the non-generation side. With fusion, we'll impact the generation side. So it's a symbiotic, holistic solution to a problem that is clearly at the forefront today of some of the scarcity elements, right? And when you said earlier about sort of the moonshot aspect, that's where the creativity typically runs the highest. Now, the difficulty is that you don't want to become too diffuse. So you have to keep a certain level of discipline about how you do that, right? And for instance, in our case, and we had long, I'd say, really constructive debates on how we do that. And we spun these things off with their own management and people that live now in the solution space, actually, in terms of their intellectual and commercial expertise, to bring that to a true product as fast as possible, as opposed to the fusion side, which tends to be more, in the creation mode still. I mean, we're getting close, and we will talk about us becoming commercial now in fusion. This is absolutely the transition we're in. But on these other things, we're already going commercial ahead of that, right? And so the character of the businesses we built is quite different, actually. And it's driven with that, and it's driven because you want to be non-dilutive to the overall effort on fusion, which otherwise you have too many things you could do at the same time, and you want to stick to the North Star.
So those two things so far, that's power and health.
Yeah, there's one in life sciences. We call it TAE Life Sciences, and it's a spawn of work we did on advanced accelerated technology. So if you think of fusion, you basically are creating a ethereal environment like in the center of a star. It means you need energy and heat deposited, and then you have to cage it, right? And all of these things require power, and all of that has to be constantly controlled. So those are some of the key technological challenges. And as we're innovating in all of these byproducts come out. So in the case of the heating equipment, which we use intense particle beams, we developed technology that can make a big dent and revolutionize some medical applications, for instance, where you need high concentrated particle beams in some form. And that dawned on us, completely unrelated to what we're doing here, that again, the DNA incarnate in the fuel injector is actually transplantable very readily into something that gives me now not only a potential for a return for our investors in a very diverse different area, but it also allows me to commercialize the core technology such that when fusion goes out and commercializes, that fuel injector is now an industrial scale supply chain solved kind of entity. And that's equally important strategically.
I think I'm getting off on those byproducts of your business, just because what I've been struck by this morning is, so you mentioned it, day one, you said, we don't want to just, be successful at the science. We want to be successful at the business.
Yep.
And then you have this model, which is, trying to solve all these things, periodically create solutions that you can monetize, kind of a banking word there, but you can do other things with. But you're on your way to a path where, and you'll say this better than me, you want to develop the technology, you want to make it commercial, but your goal is not to build many power plants. Your goal is to be the technology company behind these power plants.
Yeah, I think that's the current view on the business model, and I think it's a relatively sage thing to think of, because in the end of the day, where we're best, where our core competence is on the nexus between difficult science, engineering, machine learning, AI to the degree applicable, and then the integration of that into control infrastructure and such. We're the general contractor today. The machine out here is built, designed, and ultimately built by us with fabrication partners, right? But if we think further in the next step for us, there's one more now to be built, which is a prototype commercial 50 megawatt reactor. We can talk about that a little bit. That's our next sort of 5-year journey now to do that, and we're well underway. And then after that comes hopefully a scaling into a market, a very large market. And you could build another GE out of TAE or Siemens or whatever you prefer that could do that, right? It's vertically integrated, gets into the manufacturing and distribution, the sales, and in the after servicing and all these things. That's not possible, probably inefficient. And so we've looked at this and said, our core competence is the mix of these things. Let us work together and then exploit, if you will, the collective distribution of competence and keep us to where we're really sharp and build a world-class technology house capable, just like a Qualcomm, perhaps. They don't make the cell phones typically, but most of the communications incarnate in that, and some of the software and things are done there, and others adopt that then into a final product. So that's sort of a bit the model.
Well, it seems like, honestly, I'm not an expert, but some of the real leading breakthrough technology companies, that was the model. They focused all their attention on developing the technology and then licensed it or got others to build it who specialize in the economies of scale and all that.
That's right.
But would you mind talking about, well, let's just take it head on. The one question I think everybody has about fusion is when, and that's been the question for a long time. And I think you're making the case, and we are increasingly with you, that it's not. It's been shortened. So something has happened. We talked about how AI has improved things, material science has improved things. You guys have been at it for 28 years you've got 500 people. So, but for those watching, trying to understand why do I need to have this on my radar in the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years? Why is it different now, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's an awesome confluence of multiple facts, right? On our side, particularly, there's maturity on how to operate these things. There is a huge reduction.
You have so much knowledge. You've just
how
these experiments.
That's right, and the systems now are running in a beautifully self-controlled way almost. We have machine learning and AI tools that actually optimize the operation, right? And they can in real time actually react to things that may need to be corrected on the blink of an eye. Just think about that. That alone is incredible innovation, right? That happened. And we've mastered that today. That machine does this every day, about 50 times a day. And we know from the data we have that we can forecast that that paradigm will translate to the power plant. So we can replicate the tools we have now.
You can see the
pace of more ambitious.
You can see the pace of learning and project it out. Is that
absolutely the pace of learning, the pace of performance that will come at that level? We can project these things from current data, a lot of data. There's 100,000 plus experiments on this machine alone, and you can add all that, and you can see that you're at the cusp of building a power plant, which is why we're confident we can do that now. And that's one part to that. The other one is that the tools are now available at the performance level of the power plant. And there's a lot of them, right? And so when I started, for instance, naively as a theoretical physicist, I totally underestimated the amount of tool development. I think we had the science pretty right, almost spot to where we still are.
You look back at the science of the 90s as we knew it, and your comment was,
it hasn't moved really. Yeah. What has moved now is we have the tools to do it, right? And not just at the level of this, and we can talk about performance here or to the power plant in a moment, but we now have the tools capable at the power performance level of the plant. And I think that adds to that, right? So it's a confluence of technical readiness, scientific understanding, operational mastery. And now I think what you see at TAE is bringing in the commercial capability, right? So now we're onboarding team members and people to create that muscle that allows us to then commercialize efficiently and bring that into a final product that eventually will see the market, right? So I think that's on TAE. Now, if you go a step out, you also have macro interesting things, right? The scarcity of power is such now that the amount of capital that flows into this system has increased. Mm-hmm. And that's about the right moment, because our step function change is from a machine like this, which is in the hundreds of millions, to a machine that's in the billions, right? A power plant. And so the capital availability is scaling with that ambitious step we have. Mm-hmm. And that's because the markets now understand critically they need it. I mean, we talked earlier about one of our partners, Google, for instance, right? And their ambitions to make sure they've got enough juice for the data centers. They are investing in our space. They've not only been a partner in the trenches of the science and technology development at TAE, but they've invested in TAE. They've invested in some of the other and a few other fusion companies as well. Why? Because the scarcity is driving that, right? And that opens up strategic investment that wasn't there 5-6 years ago. So that's another thing that comes in. So you've got science, technology, the capital availability, and with all of that now, the view that commercialization is really around the corner. And can I predict 5 years exactly? I mean, obviously, the behooper is to say it's going to be exactly 5 years from now, but it's close to that. And it's not 30 years and it's not even 10 years.
It also the other trend that is on the world. Mike did the update, which for the last 3 months has included Hormuz almost every week,
Yeah.
but is the security component. If you develop this technology, this is a standalone, incredible provider of energy that obviously dovetails nicely with national security.
Totally. I think, I mean, we spoke about this earlier too, and you had guests last week on your podcast talking about the sort of apolitical nature of nuclear, right? In the sense that this is a bipartisan supported effort in the US and anywhere in the world. People understand that duality is there, right? It can improve the environment, of course. It can improve the availability of electrons for quality of life, but it's a national security thing, an energy independence thing, 100%.
To that point, we also talked a little bit about like everything, this is a competition with China as well, and they're coming pretty hard.
Yeah, I was just going to go to that. That absolutely, China is clearly a concern in the sense that they are competing at scale. I would actually say they're at the moment out competing us on a sort of governmental impact level. The amount of money that the U.S. is spending in fusion versus China, we're dwarfed by the Chinese investments. We don't know exactly the scale, but we have a pretty good understanding, and it could be as an order of magnitude difference. And if that were sustained without any consolidated response in the West, they'll outrun us because in the end, resources will drive the final summit assault. While the private sector is now starting to invest a lot more, and more private players in the space than when we started, we were the only one. But it requires capital intensity at the final step. And so I think this is the other thing. I think that geopolitical current that we're in is also conducive. And particularly the competitiveness across the Pacific, I think, is driving this as well.
I was also struck by, so you mentioned you've been private from day one. You just referenced the Chinese. There are other governmental-led efforts. This is obviously big science, big challenge, big opportunity. But there's something unique about private funding. It's not as plentiful, but it's so focused. And it demands everyone measure again, rethink. Like, can you talk about that aspect of your culture? Because it obviously drove the commercialization decisions. It's driven a lot of the choices, but it seems to drive progress in a way that you can't in a government program.
Oh, 100%. I'm a big believer in it, as painful as it can be sometimes. Because you sort of make a pact. You're going to deliver on X dollars, the machine and the results out, and the blueprint for the next one, right? And if any of that falls outside your predicted windows, you run out of money. And so there's no better forcing function than that to drive you to stay lean, mean, focused, and on the rails to the North Star, right? And that's really what's the story of TAE. We've built this business with a total capital of about 1.5 billion now, over close, as you said, make it almost 3 decades, right? Money by milestone. Every time we said we were going to deliver this, and these are the parameters we're going to chase, and this is the budget we need to have for that. And then we chased that and we delivered that. And if we hadn't delivered it, we would be gone. And that's the ultimate forcing function. And it makes you extremely focused, like you said. It also sometimes makes you, that the scientist has the propensity to go meander, right? In the sense that it's not just mental, if you will, attention or discipline. There's this sort of lure that something cool comes up. You want to go in the rabbit hole, right? And there's nothing better but this final sort of forcing function to not let that happen. And while I can control that to a degree, when I see it drift, I can call the senior staff together and say, guys, the rails are over here, the North Star is there, and you got to go here. But when people start feeling that themselves, it doesn't even amount to the need for a big course correction, right? And so the company as a whole has done remarkably well in staying on the rails. And I think if I talk to the colleagues in the space that are in the national labs and universities, they're stunned, right? I mean, when they first saw us emerge, they were laughing at it and said, well, this is the realm for big government. These are big national lab projects. Bunch of cowboys in a garage in California. Feels completely at odds with that. And but then we delivered quality science at the scale of any of the good facilities and at a faster rate, right? in a sense. And that woke people up that this model has its huge advantages. And I think you were spot on. I think it creates the kind of discipline that just funnels you. And look, the other flip side is it's efficient in the sense that if we discover we can't do it, there's no lifeline. It ends, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't waste capital either into a prolonged, agonizing death going nowhere.
Maybe one of those, commercial mindset decisions. If I could ask you to explain the tritium boron choices and why that is why you made that choice and how it links to commerciality.
Yeah, so again, TAE started with the end in mind, right? And that's been our mantra. And so what does that mean? A power plant has a couple of obvious attributes: cost competitiveness, reasonable maintenance, and likely, hopefully, environmentally friendly, right? Clean and so on, sustainable. And so when you look at fusion, it sort of meets the sustainable and clean. There's no carbon, very little radioactivity in almost all kinds of fusion. There's some in some. We have none on the boron. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you come to the other aspects, cost and maintenance and those things, right? And that's where when you look at fuel choices, and I must admit, I wish there were more. Nature gave us a few, but isn't that plentiful. There's about 3 or so fuel cycles that make sense terrestrially. And on the extremes, you have on one end deuterium tritium you mentioned, which are two hydrogen isotopes. What are they defined by? The fuel input is radioactive. The fuel output is radioactive. It's super scarce. Tritium, we have about 50 kilos in the world. It's hard to build an industry around that. You have to breed it in the machine. So we have to solve that problem as well. It's also a classified substance, mind you. It's used in warheads, right, in our thermonuclear weapons. So it's got that handicap. Boron, on the other hand, is easily available, ubiquitous. It's a mainstay product. It's in detergents. It's in cleaning products. It's mined by the metric ton. We talked about maybe a trip out to U.S. Borax's facility out in Boron in the Mojave here. So it doesn't suffer that. It's not radioactive as an input. It makes helium as an output. There's no carbon. There's no toxic stuff, right? And we have a scarcity of helium. Mind you, we won't make much because fusion is super efficient. But anyway, the point being, there's a big juxtaposition, right? And what it means when you translate it is, in one hand, fuel economics is a non-event. You don't have to breed it in the machine. There's no lifetime limitation because it doesn't make radioactivity. Tritium, you get that. So when we looked at that, we said the North Star dictates those check boxes. You've got to go there.
This was 98.
This is actually early to mid 90s even. And the credit goes to my incredible PhD mentor, Norm Rostocker, who, I was a greenhorn then, but he understood this, right? And he looked at that. Now, I didn't speak it on the flip side. There is a flip side. Nothing is free in the world, right?
Yeah.
Boron needs about a factor of 10 more complex reactor performance capability, higher temperature, different pressurization, et cetera. And that's more challenging. And so what we deliberately chose was that the economic and these other factors that determine the ideal power plant need to override our aversion as physicists to try to take a path less traveled with perhaps more physics risk. And we chose that because we said if we don't solve that, we may check the boxes on the energy, but then we can't commercialize it, right? And this is where we drove in the direction where we went. And we had the 20 years were full of gnawing away and getting rid of the technical and science risk. And we've done that.
I just, as a layperson, fusion admirer, the thought that you were staring at that challenge and said, okay, we could go this way or we could go that way. If we go the second way, the fusion might be more economic, but it's going to be harder. As if it wasn't hard enough. It's kind of fascinating that you stared at fusion and said, let's make it harder. But if we get there, it has a better chance of being economic.
That's right.
Pretty incredible.
It was a very deliberate decision. You can see this in lots of all our first pitches to anybody, our friends and family gatherings that formed the early board and the early support to the company. This was very clearly understood. I will tell you again, as a 80-year-old, ambitious and naive, that is my handicap. I didn't have the problem. I bring the stuff on. We're mans to do it, right? And now, of course, sobered up over the years and understood that you should ask, would I make the same choice today with everything I know? I probably would, because I think in the end, this is not a textbook enterprise, but it's for making a commercial product. But I would certainly be a bit more hesitant and a little bit more, exploring the consequences of that decision I did then. And, it's a classic entrepreneurial story. If you knew how tall the mountain is, you may never leave base camp, right?
That's true.
So we left in the fog of the inversion layer. And when the clouds lifted, we were far enough up that nobody said we're going to turn down. We're going to get the summit.
So good. Fusion watchers, again, know the basic equation that we are trying to get to a situation where you get more energy out of it than you put in that caused the fusion. And I was thinking about this from a cost standpoint, because as I understand it, okay, we did that at Livermore. We used the laser, and so we did achieve something, but there's this commerciality component, and then. But do you mind talking about that net energy concept, and just make sure everybody in our audience understands it?
Yeah, that's a complex subject, of course, right? So what does it mean to get net energy? So first of all, fusion requires very extreme conditions, right? High temperature, high pressure.
You might tell people the temperatures.
And I can, so just for reference, the sun is about 15 million degrees. Our fusion reactors start at about 100 million, and they go up to about 1 billion, depending on fuel. So very high temperatures. Unfortunately, we don't have the gravitational compression of the sun and the packing of particles. So we have to make up with higher temperatures for that deficiency terrestrially. So that drives us to conditions that are already in this machine. It's at 75 million today. That's like 5x plus of the center of the sun, right? So it's.
And do you mind, just because, so we were walking around this machine, we are not in like a, 500 miles from civilization here. So that there is no, it sounds like when you hear something like that, 75 million degrees, like this must be an incredibly dangerous thing, but it's not. But would you mind just sharing?
Yeah, that's the other perversity, which gets to the question too, how do you keep it there, right? So what happens now is you've got this hot soup, but it's very few particles that are hot. So the perversity is that inside of this machine is vacuum, and we're almost making power out of vacuum, out of nothing, right? Because we basically pump everything out, which is a big vacuum container. It's like the surface of the moon, similar conditions. And now we introduce a handful of particles, and now we heat those up to those crazy conditions. But that total energy in that is tiny. If I were to put my hand in there, I would cool that off without my hand frying crisp. That's how ethereal it is, right? And so in a way, when that small cloud of super hot stuff hits the cold wall, it cools off instantaneously and stops reacting. Now you lose everything, right? In a sense, you don't make any power. So you've got to cage this stuff. So the first problem is get it hot, and then you have to keep it hot. And the keeping hot turns out is actually the harder part, which is what we've been all as an industry working on for maybe 70 years now, right? And but now we have made the headway to understand that, and we've got the tools. But coming back to the problem, right? This means you have to cage it. You need to make sure that the hot stuff stays hot and insulated from the other things. And you do this with electromagnetic fields. You can't touch the stuff to cool it off, right? So we have sophisticated magnets and electric fields and so on. And then there's all this sort of without touching things, action of it from a distance, tools for that. That's what makes this so challenging, right? And now that those tools are perfected, in and of itself, the orchestration of the tools is there, our software and control systems and the machine learning tools we use. So now you can combine that and you make summit assault out of it, right? And that's where we're going now. Our next one is going to take all this up into the 100 million plus and up to maybe 1 billion degrees to burn as efficiently as possible boron. And then you have your first commercial reactor.
Man, those temperatures, wow, that's crazy. Maynard, keep your hands.
It's hotter than Houston, Mike.
Yeah, keep your hands away from that hot soup, Maynard. I know you're going to try and.
Yeah.
No, look, last week we had a special COBT where we had the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Reactors with the DOE. You mentioned that earlier here. He mentioned his biggest concern for nuclear is the U.S. workforce. And so my question is, can the U.S. build the supply chains? Do we have the workforce? Do we have the industrial base to pull fusion off? And what does that look like? What does that build out look like in your mind?
That's a great question. I would firmly answer yes, but with the caveat that, it's not at the scale it needs to be, but the kernel is there. So we've historically been the best at this in this business. I mean, the Russians were quite good during the heyday of the Cold War. Europe had a very frontier machine. The Asians, particularly the Chinese, are now really pushing into that, as we said earlier. And they are at the cusp of overtaking us in terms of resources, people, and, skill. Also, they now educate their own workforce in this. They used to all bring the kids over here to go through graduate training in the US, right? That's less so today. We see that. That's interesting. And that tells you that they've matured inside, which is another concerning element. So answer your question though, on the US side, I think we have the institutional capability to train. I think there's a resurgence of interest because of people see companies like us in the fission space, right, now becoming successful towards commercialization. There's a huge renaissance in belief overall in nuclear and also in the execution of it. So the young people pick up. So there are more people going into graduate school and into the harder sciences to go make a dent on this. So I'm very optimistic. I see it with my friends in academia who train the next generation of people we hire, right? Companies like us are also digging deeper into the educational space to bring about talent. We're sponsoring stipends for students in undergraduate and graduate level and so on. And I think you also see the academic field adapting now more courses to applied physics work, for instance, so that people come already out with an understanding that's more conducive to a quick scale up into come into here. So I think those things are happening. I'm not saying they're happening fast enough. I wish they were faster, but they're happening. So I think ultimately we'll get there. Today we couldn't scale there yet, but we don't need it today. We need it in about 5 to 10 years, right? So probably correct, but we can't afford a lot of missteps. So we got to stay on the ball of it.
This conversation with 4 or 5 years ago was, hey, we just need to go low carbon, low carbon, low carbon. That was a priority, and now all of a sudden, the last couple of years, it's about affordability. And so when I think about fusion, who are the customers ultimately? Is it going to be the basically cost plus providers, meaning the electric utilities? Is it going to be merchant generators? Is it going to be industrial? Is it going to be the U.S. government, Department of Defense? How do you think about who your customers will initially be? And what will they be initially looking for? Is it cost? Is it just, or is it something in addition as opposed to a subtraction type of a product?
That's a great question. And in fact, I was prepared to say all of the above, but then you added initial. And I was going to qualify that, right? I think there is differentiation on time, right? So if you look at this today, the utilities would not buy that, right? Because that has no practical delivered reliability picture yet. It'd be a new technology, right? So they're very nervous about anything that goes on their grid has to always perform because any of us flips the switch, we expect lights to go on. So they're going to be under pressure to not go there. It's also from a financing perspective, it will need the more metrics behind it, it becomes financeable for the utility model. This is where, in fact, years ago, I was concerned about how we're going to cross that gap, right? From coming from the lab and maybe a first prototype, which is privately financed, to how do you now start to deploy at scale. But I think that's dramatically changed now. You mentioned the hyperscalers, for instance, right? The behind the meter, that's a phenomenal forcing function for us that didn't exist, right? And I think that's exactly where I believe when you ask the initial where it's going to go. I think it's also true that it will go into niches where cost is almost maybe not even the second driver. If you think defense, if you had a way to put this on Diego Garcia, or one of these island outposts where we have critical, resources in the Pacific or in anywhere in the world, where today they have to spend gobs of money and resources and are in fact in a way exposed to transmit, for instance, hydrocarbons across the planet, right? If they can get rid of that as a strategic upside from a defense perspective, then that will find traction. And I think you'll see this. I think last week you guys talked about this a little bit, right? With microreactors, for instance, in DoD or now the Department of War. I think that is another area. Could we think of sort of compartmentalized smaller units that could fit an aircraft carrier, something very large? And obviously it wouldn't be the next thing we do, but that'd be a step that'd be interesting to look at. But I think bases in remote areas, certainly a DoD application. Behind the meter, I think all the hyperscalers are looking at that. That's why Google is, doubling up on fusion investments as they have been doing with us and some of our competitors. It makes sense. If I were them, I would do exactly that. And I think though, and in industrial applications, both of energy and heat, electrons and heat. For instance, we have a partnership, which we didn't speak of today, but with Oxy. Oxy consumes a lot of process heat in both, in some of the petrochemical refining, but also they're working on these carbon sequestration or carbon capture systems, right? Some of it is for oil exploration. In fact, mostly it is. But that system requires high heat, process heat. So fusion can deliver that, right? And that is, in fact, interesting also because it is a step before you even have to convert. So it's an interesting opportunity. We are partnered up, in fact, to look at those things. So I think there's a diversified set of recently emergent opportunities that are going to precede the utility deployment. And in fact, it's important because that's going to give us the ability to demonstrate reliability. And then you scale into the people who demand ultimate reliability.
Will fusion have this aspect of a little bit like the micro nuclear guys talk about, which is, it's a power plant, it's delivered to the site, it stays there for a number of years. You just simply come and replace it, that type of dynamic? Or how should we think about maintenance or replacement or, down the road?
I think that, again, that's now not just, now you got to split fusion versus fusion, right? So in our case, and I'll just talk about TAE. TAE will be able to deploy a plant, and we believe it'll have call it 40-year plant life, which is conventionally today what people think of power assets, the typically 40-year plant life, right? We can deliver that we believe at a cost and at a maintenance overhead commensurate with what they have today. So it checks a lot of other boxes, and it fits exactly with the paradigm and the amortization that they use on financing these things. And so it's unique. If you're with Tritium, for instance, now you got some servicing and other things, and I don't want to necessarily go there right now. But so I think we can fit that model. So I wouldn't see it as the micro where you load it up, it's fueled, and when it runs out, you got to replace it. This doesn't suffer that. It will have a maintenance cycle, which you will have in anything. But you have a 40-year plant life, and maybe it will be longer than 40 years. Who knows?
I was mentioning, Michl, up front that it's summer. Albert and I want to get out and travel, and we came up with this theme of visiting California places because California has so much happening. It's really amazing. Are there things about being in California, which I know you were from UC Irvine, but there's so much intellect and entrepreneurialism here. But what about being in California has been helpful, unique, challenging? Just what would you say about that?
Yeah, so first, of course, I think I'm European by birth, right? So I grew up in Europe as a kid, came over to the US to go to college, and then obviously got stuck here developing this. Wouldn't want it any other way, by the way. Feel very American now, but I will tell you this: the entrepreneurial spirit here, and it's true for all the U.S., but particularly in California, is very strong, right? And I always say that in opposed to China, where I think you can sort of by edict move 10,000 people to do something, but if they lack the entrepreneurial curiosity, then that's a handicap, right? We don't have shortage of that here. And I think that's why I think we can always outcompete if we align some of the other things. Coming back to California, I think that part is strong. The ecosystem on the venture capital side is super strong. We've hugely benefited from the proximity to go to Sand Hill Road and attract capital. And I've made great friends in in NEA and other of the bigger VCs. And so I think that's been wonderful. I think where California is a little challenging is, it's gotten over the years more bureaucratic. The amount of overhead in getting things permitted, I don't want to get into the complexity of getting something like this built here. And, I could probably do that in Texas or Georgia or Alabama probably in half the time, or maybe even less. Which is, as we're looking at siting for a power plant now, we are, looking competitively across various states, exactly because of that. The other challenge in California is because there's so much intense competition that the labor pool is scarcer than other places of the world, in the US and overseas as well, right? We've got, if you think back a few years, I mean, you had in the proximity of the LA area, right? You had SpaceX, the other aerospace companies, TAE's here, I mean, which is a small player, but then you go north, you've got, the hyperscalers. you've got Tesla, and there's only so many people around control engineering and some of the hard sciences we need that everybody wants and competes for, right? So it's sometimes hard to fill positions effectively in terms of hiring and also in terms of the cost, right? And I can't compete with an Apple in terms of salaries and stuff, and I have to make up by the fact that the work's more meaningful here.
But I was going to say that last part is so interesting. You can compete in terms of the mission.
Yes.
This draws real excitement.
And that's super important because not every day is a success day, right? I mean, it built something like this. There are moments of despair where something doesn't work, and then God forbid something breaks. So not only are you struggling to get to where you want it, but now you have a setback, you got to repair something expensive, and it takes you time. And those moments require the passion and the deep belief in the mission for people to just stick it through. And of course, the sweet moment of success then makes up for all that, right? But sometimes to get to that, you still need to hang in. And I think that's been one of those incredible opportunities that what I call the grand purpose behind it kind of crystallizes out that best in humans to stick it together. And if you look at TAE, it's not just on the workforce. Our investors, I mean, our board, our entire orbit of support has been remarkable. I mean, if you added up all the risks on the way or the probabilities of success, you would have probably assigned close to 0 to many of these steps. And then the compound product, right, multiplying these small numbers is 0, but we're here. And we're here because of that. No question.
Thinking of the mission, when you go back to mid-90s, your own passion for this, what would you have said as a young man what was the main reason you chose this?
I had a feeling that we had to solve the energy problem in the sense have scalable, reliable, clean energy. And I wasn't at that point obviously aware of the explosion of some of the data center needs, and the kind of exponential scale up that we're currently in was not predictable. But I just thought if you look at sustainability and a reliable infrastructure around next generation energy that has some scalability, you start to wonder with what we had how well that would do, right? And then we started to understand that forgetting the environmental impact, the resources we dig out of the ground are finite, right? And as a kid, I didn't quite understand what finite meant, but I saw that, and I also didn't like the fact that the world was constantly at war over resources. I thought if we can scale fusion, we would truly create. I mean, it's a cliche and kind of weird, but it's kind of an age of abundance, right? Because if we can set free copious amounts of energy at competitive cost without the resource constraints of oil being in certain parts of the world only, or what we're seeing now, all of these things, and it's been the same since generations, right? Since almost the dawn of humanity, right? This would epochally put us in a different era. And I thought that would be something that, we may not be able to digest well. It's a philosophical question, but it could solve a lot of those things, right? And so it was a super, it was just a mission that felt something too cool to not do.
Yeah. I was thinking one thing Mike mentioned last week, we had the Deputy Secretary for Nuclear on with us, and regulatory reform came up and how important that's been. Also, this just bipartisan enthusiasm for things nuclear. Would you mind talking about because we now have a fusion framework, I believe, from a regulatory standpoint the first time. So if that's not a sign that this is real, I'm not sure what is. I mean, the government is ready, but talk about that piece of it.
Yeah, 100%. So I love the podcast because I'm obviously following
vision. We're honored you watched it. You've got a lot going on here to take.
Well, I also knew that we were going to talk, and I wanted to get a little bit feel for it. But I thought that it's homework. But I think that was particularly meaningful because it really that industry part of us, the other side of our nuclear cousins in fission. We're struggling a lot with that, right? I mean, the economics is defined by many things. Amongst them is the regulatory burden. And how much safety do you have to have? What is your siting requirements? How long will it take you to site and permit and then get approval on a project? Because that determines financeability, right? If you look into commercialize, one of the biggest concerns I had, if we ended up in a 10-year quagmire with a very undefined at first exploratory regulatory environment to kind of weed through as a first entrant to that, we could get ground up. Nothing of our own wrongdoing, nothing wrong with technology, but it just sits somewhere in a limbo of bureaucracy, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's huge credit to the last two administrations, actually, to perfect that, right? We saw that at the tail end of the Biden administration. The NRC first, on the commission level, decided that fusion should be regulated like medical isotope production. So that if you go to an accelerator site that makes PET medicine, right, for PET scanners, there's a little nuclear component to it. These sites they're regulated today, and permitting there takes you on the order of 18 months or so to be able to go build that. That's not what we had historically in fission. You're talking decadal problem, right? And now we know fusion will be regulated under that umbrella, which means we're going to be much more predictable. We'll have a short time scale to get that done. That creates certainty for financing and makes projects actually financeable, much more attractive. And it allows us ultimately to be earlier competitive as a technology provider against the conventional generators. So I think this was a huge step. I may say quickly that actually the Brits were ahead of us. The UK decided that.
Are there other places where fusion is licensable?
Yeah, so the UK was the first to put this very similar framework in place. We were lucky that happened because we could go to the NRC and point to that. And so as we were working with the staff and developing that, that was a big helpful thing to see. Another very well thoughtful, regulated place do it right. And it all comes back that fusion is just safe. It's just much safer, right? And it deserves therefore a lighter touch. And we were able now to get that, and now it's anchored in U.S. law. In the summer of 24, it was signed into law that fusion will not just on the agency side be regulated like that, but then now it's codified. So it gives us very high degree of certainty, and that totally changes again the ability to commercialize. Say earlier, that'd be the other pillar that I may have missed earlier: technology, science, capital, the need, and now you have also the regulation coming together. So it's a perfect moment to scale.
So I was wondering that as you went through your variables there, have we missed anything that you're still waiting on, or that is underdeveloped, or are the components in place and now you just got to deliver?
Yeah, I think they're pretty much in place. I mean, we still obviously have to jump from here to the power plant, but I think, as I described earlier, we're very confident we can do that. We have a machine that we call Da Vinci that's blueprinted now. Essentially, we are working on siting. We hope to finish that up later this year, the siting process, and then furiously getting to building, right? And so somewhere within 5 years, roughly speaking, in 2031 or so, we should be in a position to start making electrons.
And when you talk about 5 years, is that principally because you look at the rate of progress you're making in terms of net energy and cost, and you just look at what the data is telling you, and you look at the rate of change of data, and that kind of spits out? So probably 5 years we're there. Or like, how do you get that number, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, so it's a great question. There's sort of two drivers to that number, right? One is the construction of a new facility.
Just
and
physically,
you got to, and you're going to start with likely a relatively greenfield site.
Yeah.
So you got to put infrastructure in, you erect buildings, you eventually build the complicated machine in there. It has to interact with the outsides around it. So that's a finite time scale. And we're pretty good at that. We've built 3 of these of this scale. We've been 5, this is generation 5 actually, but 3 of about this scale, which is almost the scale of a power plant. And
physically, do you mind just telling people this latest machine, how big it is?
So this thing is about like 2 double-decker buses, if you will, back to back. That's the core, and then you've got periphery. So you're looking at the power plant maybe about a factor of 2 bigger. And that will give
4 double-decker.
So 4 double-decker buses make it, and that'll get you to something like 500 megawatts, about scale of a large gas turbine, right? In size and also in power output. So that's our North Star end goal. We think we will be able to incarnate the first of those in about 5 years. So construction is design, construction, and assembly are the gatekeepers.
And you'll do that yourself.
And we're going to be the general contractors with partners doing that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, once you have it delivered, you got to deliver the performance and show the data, right? And that's the step that, in fact, historically has always been more unpredictable. We've developed machine learning tools that we've deployed since 3 generations on making that final step very programmatically schedulable. It sounds kind of counterintuitive that you go in the unknown, but you can. But they're tools that can actually compartmentalize these steps. And we know from operational experience now how long it takes. So I think the forecast is very thoughtfully done. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm very optimistic we'll meet it. I mean, could something slip by 6 months? Of course it's possible. But we've good experience, and I think we will get very close to that data set.
You made this comment on the tour, which was really interesting because we're in your control room. There's a lot of people with monitors and knowledge and watching everything, but the computer is running these simulations, as I heard you. But
the actual experiments.
The experiments.
Yeah.
But the other comment was about what you have found, which is periodically the human interaction where your team says, let's choose that. It was a very interesting comment about how this is wildly automated and all this AI is turbocharging your ability to do it, but yet there's a really critical human component here.
There is. And, I think that's the wonderful thing. I've been to a couple of AI conferences and was asked on panels about, there was conversations mostly about things like, will AI sort of take out the human as an important component, even yoke us under its control, et cetera. And I said, I can't speak about the general comment, but as it applies here, there is a very interesting aspect in that intuition and sort of ideation and creation is not quite yet taught to these systems, right? I mean, they're very good at taking inference from stuff that's there with some level of extrapolation perhaps, but mostly it's fact-based on what's known, and they just are better at combining all that than our brain can. They don't forget anything, and they can infinitely compute around it. What they don't do yet, right, and may never do quite like humans do, is sort of see something more ethereal at an ideation level and grab onto the spirit of the moment or something that is in left field. And that's what the human operator can do, right? And so we've actually demonstrated this. We wrote a couple of papers, one with Google in, I think it's 2017 or 18 in one of the Nature journals. And what we showed there was that if you, for instance, you go from A to B and it's all driven by a race into the unknown, right? Then as a human, you take incrementally small steps. There's multiple variables you can adjust. You do one at a time. You see what the cause effects are, and you do this across everything. It takes forever. You can automate that 100%, and then the computer will just go in and permutate everything at the same time and then deconvolve it. And there are techniques to do that, and we've developed these. And you do that by itself. And then you compare it with the one where the computer does that like 80% of the time or 90%. But here and there, the human says, I saw a blip here or something that seemed like there was a vector here that's interesting. Let's explore that a little bit. And it interferes with the process. And it turns out that, and we've measured that, and it's in this paper, that combination is the fastest exponentiation to success, right? And that brings the never tiring, if you will, computing capability and absolute memory together with the spark of creation that the human can have. Mm. And that seems to be not just philosophically kind of a cute thought, it actually works. And so we have that here. We run a thing, we call it the optometrist algorithm, where actually the computer serves up various choices for the next experiment. Mm. But then the human operator can say, I pick this or that, or I tweak that one a little bit further, right? Mm. And they don't do that all the time. But in critical moments, something that the human comes up with infuses in that. And if we don't put that in, it just doesn't go as well.
Well, you've been so generous with your time. I was just thinking maybe one last question because it was kind of ticking through. Hopefully we're hitting on the big pieces. There's a lot here. It's amazing. But I'll go back to where you started, which is cost. You wanted to build something that was commercial. And so would you mind commenting out on that horizon, 5 years-ish, how you think about the cost of the power that will be provided? And also the model of it, because we touched on this a little bit. One thing is you could just take this component, you can replace the heart of another power plant and keep all the trappings in place. And you could make power with fusion, but in a traditional way. But there's another approach, which you've talked about, which is much more direct. So maybe talk about cost and how the power gets implemented.
Yeah, so in generation one, we're going to tap into James Watt's technology from the 1800s, right? Good old James Watt's
I remember that
steam
from
engine.
6th grade.
Oh,
I
yeah.
see that the steam engine picture.
That's right.
Social stuff.
And that's frankly the mainstay in most power plants today, right? So we will tap in and essentially exchange the heat source, this esoteric futuristic sun.
You put in the 4 double-decker buses.
Yeah.
Pull out whatever.
And we'll pull out heat, and that heat will convert through a conventional back end through a turbine, et cetera. And that gets you to a cost of power, which will be somewhere midfield of current generation costs. And I'm thinking now US centric, so it's cheaper than where fusion sits today. It starts out higher where we are today in some of the renewables or gas. But it'll be competitive from day one. And of course, it has other attributes, right? We didn't touch much on that. But again, if you think lesser regulation because of more safety, you can be closer to consumption centers. So you can think of a more distributed grid, a more autonomous and resilient grid, perhaps. Maybe no longer some of the big transmission lines. So you have other factors that will play in. And we haven't costed those in. But those are attributes you'll get.
Similar to micronuclear,
yeah,
if you will, but
absolutely.
Not the attributes of closer to, there's
still some, there's still some regulatory constraints that we probably in fusion wouldn't have, particularly in our kind of fusion. So somewhere think of it sort of midfield. And of course, then you drive costs down because you will automate more and you get better at fabricating, and you're engineering an even more perfected product as you go deeper through that life cycle. And this is true of pretty much everything that comes out, right? You can do this on cars, you can do it on MRI machines, on anything. If you then look at generationally the next step, that's try to replace James Watt's with what I like to call today solar cells on steroids. And by the way, that's unique to the boron fusion, right? In the tritium fusion, you'll have to rely on Watts because it's particles that bring the energy out. They have to collide with something, and that heats up a surface, and you pump coolant through there, and you extract the heat. In the case of boron, you think more like a mini sun. It radiates intense light, and that light can get absorbed, and again can become heat in the surface, and then you can use Watts, or you can run it into a special type of solar cell, I'll call, that then can convert that directly. And even if that starts its life cycle about as efficient as Watts, it would be cheaper because you wouldn't have turbo machinery and moving parts and all that, right? And so that's for us generation two. We're obviously focused enabling the core to the maximum possible first. So I always say crudely, this is kind of a hobby of ours at the moment because it's a second generation thing, but it's clearly eventually there. And once that's there, it's too far out to predict what the cost would do, but it will definitely continue to come down, right? And that's, I think, if you start life at a competitive level and you have good arguments on how you're going to bring that down further into a world of more scarcity on these other resources that we don't are afflicted by, that is a very powerful statement for fusion in the second half of the century to become a very strong component of the grid.
This is an unfair question, but so many of the developments right now seem to be towards more distributed generation. Could be could be micronuclear, could be behind the meter gas generation. But we just seem to be, when you think about the grid of the future, do you see it as a highly distributed grid? Is that trend almost unavoidable at this point?
Oh, I think it is. I think there's lots of reasons why that makes sense, right? First of all, the bigger transmission infrastructure will go away to a large degree. The resilience is better. If you think about, again, national security, energy security, right? If you had an attack, like you look what goes on in the Gulf states right now, right? If you have a centralized power plant that the Iranians can hit versus you've got 30, 40 smaller autonomous units, that's a much better recipe, right? It also, again, then allows you to take advantage in a more sort of micro level to certain environmental conditions that may be different, that one generation asset may perform better for whatever reasons, right? I think we're going there.
It allows for more variety.
Absolutely. And so I think the overall argument therefore points to that. And I think it goes there. The question is how quickly that adopts. And I think that's purely a function of, for instance, in the West, we have a lot of assets deployed that are amortized, that are still functional.
Yeah.
there's a resistance from obvious resistance from a financial consideration to go replace all that overnight, and that's just not going to happen. So adoption cycles may take a while here versus somewhere else.
I guess the only thing the distributed system doesn't have is big scale.
Well, that depends. Well, sometimes that's true, but think about what if you replicate many smaller systems and you build a lot of them.
Yeah.
And you get economies of scale through a different compartmentalization, right? And I mean, you're certainly right that sometimes, and it depends on the linearity or non-linearity of what drives the cost, where you end up, right? But I think the way we have looked at this, we see that a 500 megawatt scale size is a great building block because, first of all, you don't have to go only there. You can aggregate multiple, right? So if you want to replace a gigawatt centralized, multi-gigawatt centralized model like our current grid, this technology just will have 4 units sit there at 500 apiece to get you the 2 gigawatts nuclear replaced that may be on the site. The advantage that also has is if one goes down, you don't lose the entire, power. You'll have, 3/4 still running. So I think it certainly enables, and this building block is also, by the way, we didn't come up with that out of nowhere, right? We looked at the physics, the engineering, and the cost again, and said, where does it cross over? And then you very quickly see that this is a good scale. For instance, if you think about the deployment cycle and you think logistics, one of the things we want to do is we want to cookie cutter these in a centralized fabrication setting, right? You want to not do what Big Fission did, which is everything is monolithic, one-up built, et cetera, and the cost is very hard to drive out. If you cookie cutter factory produce it, you don't have that, right? The problem then is you got to get it from point A to point B. So if the unit size is too big, you now lose the ability to transport, right? So you want to make sure that the scale again is in a way compatible with any one of those constraints. And I think for us at that 500 megawatt level, it checks all those boxes.
Well, this has been fantastic. I didn't monitor the clock, religiously, but it's our first fusion show. So, I mean, we got to go over a little bit. That was tremendous. What does come next? I mean, if you think about next 6-12 months, what should people be looking for or watching for? Maybe that time frame is artificial, but that as we leave, is there something we should be watching for?
I think it's a great point. I mean, we are promising milestones. We should be held accountable for those, right? And I'm proud of these now because I think we understand what we're doing. So we're upgrading this machine. We should see DT level performance, about 100 million degrees coming out of this somewhere within the next 18 months or so, plus or minus. And then, and this is in parallel to us building what I called earlier Da Vinci, which is our demonstration unit. And there you will see a siting selection announcement, probably around late in the year, and then moving from there into early phases construction. And then, as I said, somewhere about 2031, we should be at the point where that thing is fully running and optimized, and we should be expecting data that can show us then that, we're making more electrons than what we're consuming.
That's the one where people will say, I like it, I can touch it, I see the data, it works, you have the experience, go.
Yep.
Right?
That's right. And again, as we talked earlier about some of our spin-off stuff, I mean, those have their own commercialization vector. They are absolutely commercializing today. And while this isn't the conversation, tap into that, but there will be commercial relevant announcements and people will see it. And that's wonderful because it offsets, the pressure to return capital, of course, to our investors and the opportunity to, in a way, see that TAE has this multi-pronged opportunity set to become a very commercial and investable player.
Well, it's fascinating. What a great morning. Thank you for having us. Thank you, everybody.